are pleased to be joined by Julian Khalili of the Richmond Kickers Soccer Club in Richmond, Virginia. Julian is a Zone 1 coordinator in collaboration with the club's program directors and responsible for the development and oversight of a consistent player development identity for all Zone 1 players ages U6 through U12. Julian currently holds a USSF C license, as is the process of applying for his B. He's earned a United Soccer Coaches Advanced National Diploma and Futsal Level 1 Diploma. He plans on working towards the A license and has an aspiration of earning a PhD in the fields of research he is so passionate about, and we are so thankful for him sharing with us today. Please welcome to the podcast, Julian Khalili. Well, thanks for joining us, Julian. I really appreciate you taking the time. And so let's just jump right into it. I became acquainted with your kind of line of thinking and your coaching philosophy. And I guess if we boxed it into using the term representative design, what is that? What is representative design to you in terms of the coaching context?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So representative design is a term that is specific to the context you're talking about. So whether you're coaching skiing or badminton, soccer, basketball, anything, in hockey, in your case, to know specifically what makes a game representative, you have to look at it in what we like to call an ecological view. And what that really means is, without getting too technical, because I'm no expert in the subject.
Me neither.
I've learned a lot from reading and listening to podcasts like this. And basically what an ecological view is looking at the individual and the environment not as separate entities, which is kind of primarily how things have been done for a long time. And there's a huge world of studying them in their interaction with one another. So you're not separating them. You're looking at how the environment shapes the individual and how the individual behaves based off of how they perceive the environment. And you get into a whole lot of stuff. And so that's why when you look at the environment and the relationship with the individual, you start to ask yourself the question, well, what is the environment of my game that I'm coaching, right? And so if the game is soccer, in my case, which I can speak a little bit more eloquently in because I'm not so familiar with a lot of other sports, right? And so what makes a soccer game environment representative are the perceptual elements that the individual would have to be able to pick up on in the environment. And so I learned this from Mark O'Sullivan, who is a mentor of mine, and people in this field talk a lot about what makes it representative. And so if you ask that question, you think, okay, ball, opponent, direction, consequence, and then representative information. And consequence is something that a lot of people hear and they're like, okay, it's time to run sprints or something.
No, exactly.
But it's not the same, because consequence in a perceptual way would be like, if I've made a mistake, like I've passed the ball to the other team, we can get scored on. And this type of information, it isn't like information in a book, it's information that is perceived. You've now have something
causes a reaction
that is affecting you. Right.
Exactly. Now it's funny you say that, because I read an interesting thing the other day that about Rafael Nadal, and talked about him and his shot making ability, and his comment was, no shot is the same. No shot has ever been the same that I've taken. So I don't rely on repetition as something that I ground myself in. I have to, every shot is different. It's in a different spot. It's spinning different. I'm in a different position. I'm on my toes. I'm on my heels. I'm coming towards it. I'm going away from it. And so when you really think about that, and that's arguably the world's greatest ever tennis player, and has a really grounded view, and kind of the game is different at all moments. So I need to train myself to kind of be ready to experience that. So it was pretty important comment, I thought, from somebody who has experienced everything.
Right, right. And I love that. And something in that quote, he says, like there's a million variables
Yeah,
that he has to deal with.
yeah,
Like you were saying, the surface, the weather, the type of like environment he's in completely
yeah.
changes, and how the ball is spinning and all of it. It's never ever the same shot. And that's counterproductive. Well, the argument is that it's counterproductive to train an exact way to do something.
Yeah.
Skills should be adaptable because of all these changes in circumstance
Now,
and
is
constraints.
is this a journey that you've been on? Is this something that, so for you, I mean, a lot of times coaches coach the way they were coached, and they ground themselves back into the experience that they had, whether it's at a, the U18 level, U16 level, college level, or if they're beginners. I mean, they get into coaching because of their kids. Like for you, you know, understanding this idea that the environment and the interactions between all the elements of that environment, really shape the experience. Is that something that you came to understand right away, or is that a journey for you and your coaching that you've been on?
Oh man, I had no idea at first.
Yeah.
I got into coaching. A friend asked me, and it was a club here in town. Um, and I was coaching the exact way I was coached in college and growing up. And it's a real coach-centered prescription of a movement or an activity that's out of context, because it's kind of makes sense. To work on passing, let's just do passing. To work on shooting, let's just do shooting, and let's remove them from the environment in hopes that we can kind of add everything up and then it'll work.
Yeah.
But over time, I've learned that that's not really how things are, and kind of intuitively, I've always known this.
Yeah.
I really believe this, like that you can't have creativity unless you allow them to have the context in which they're playing, and that's where the motivations are. And the constraint-led approach, like I got into that pretty early, like probably 3 years into coaching, and I
Yeah.
saw something on Twitter, and I'm like, what is this stuff? What is going on? And then ever
Yeah.
since then, I've been like buying books, listening to podcasts.
Yeah.
75% of the time, I've been confused, trying to figure it out,
Sounds
and
familiar.
asking questions and bothering people on Twitter. DMing
Yeah.
them, asking them, "What does this mean? What does this mean?" And
Yeah. So for you, what does a typical session look like then? So if we're gonna sit and watch, you interpret representative design. You said you're coaching this year U13 boy soccer club in Richmond, and so what does that session look like? You're there for an hour and or an hour and a half, 80 minutes, 90 minutes. But what does that session look like if we were to watch?
yeah, good question. Good question. So I want to preface it by saying that there's no copy and paste, because we're talking about a contextual, like a specific environment. Like you might look at something called Brofenbrenner's ecological model, bioecological model, and it's a way of describing the environmental constraints that each individual may have. So you're looking at neighborhoods, you're looking at their school system, parenting practices, government practices, and they're organized into different categories.
Right.
And so you can look more into that. But that's really important, because part of the constraints-led approach is looking at the individual constraints that are present in the environment that you're in. And so if you're looking at their like individual constraints, you're looking at their size and their speed and development, right? Like development physically and emotionally, right? And socially, and all of that interacts with the culture that we're talking about, and the neighborhoods and all those things in the model. So you have to look at your environment and like live there with them and coexist with them before you can understand how to do a constraints-led approach. And so, for me, looking at the environment in just a real general way, where I'm at, you have this kind of American competitive environment, right? And you have like first team, second team, third team, and you have this pressure on players. And you have parents having to pay to play for their kid to play. And so there's certain amounts of expectations,
Sure.
right? And then you have players looking at the standings, keeping track of scores, and everything's very professionalized. And within that environment, you look at the behavior of the players and you see how that interacts with, like, these things we're talking about. How does that interact with how they perceive the world? Because part of behavior is related to like what value they see when they're searching the environment and they're playing. When you're playing, you find value in certain things. So
and motivation too, right? I think that's important. When you feel that you're doing something that is of value, you tend to be motivated to be a willing participant in that environment.
I like that. So if my motivation is to not lose, I might kick the ball away from my goal. In a moment where I could have controlled it and looked up and done something a little bit more risky, and for lack of a better word there. And that kind of behavior can be culturally and socially accepted as well, given the constraints. And so that I would call unskilled behavior. And so they call it amplifying or dampening certain constraints. So if that's one that I think is if the pressure is over constraining behavior to the point where they're just kicking the ball away, I might want to dampen that constraint by allowing mistakes in practice and encouraging them. Right. And so this kind of stuff where you're really interacting with the individuals and how they are affected by society in a way is more important than the content of your practice. Right. So, but like a normal practice, I'll just talk for U11s. It's a little bit easier.
Okay.
That's okay. For U11s, across the club at Richmond Kickers, we're working on like kind of changing some of these things we're talking about. And the first one is like trying to develop or foster better movers. So we might play a game of tag at the beginning in various forms where they're jumping, they're throwing, they're rolling. They're having to like see what's around them and interact and make sure that they don't bump into each other. And there's these processes of self-organization going on, which is a huge part of ecological dynamics. So if you ever want to look into that stuff, self-organization is basically when you or a group have behaviors that emerge given the constraints of an activity.
It's funny you say that because like I'm coaching my little guy, he's 5. So what we would call Timbit hockey, and he's getting started. And so, we have half the ice surface and we have 4 groups of kids moving around and doing their thing. And you talk about self-organization. I mean, that's essentially with 5-year-olds, they're trying to work their way through all of that experience. And, we did a little exercise on the weekend where we have balloons. And so, the biggest challenge when you play hockey is, you're on razor blades, trying to do movements that, even at a 5-year-old, like they're still kind of figuring out their environments and how they move. Now you're adding another level of complexity to it with ice skates on it. So them becoming comfortable on their blades is the number one important thing. It's going to give them the reason to be motivated to continue to play, or in some instances become so difficult and the game is so hard that they tend to kind of, turn their back on it. But they like the challenge. But, having kids inside one of the face-off circles kind of trying to keep a balloon up. And, while it seems like a pretty menial task for a hockey player, they don't have a stick, they just have their gloves and they're batting a balloon in the air. It became a really good way because they're aware of their surroundings. They're aware of their buddies who are next to them. They're twisting, they're turning, and all the while they're getting comfortable on these razor blades that are attached to their feet. So I think sometimes as coaches, or as maybe the outside forces on coaches, they see a game of tag, or they see a coach using balloons or tennis balls or something that's not native to that sport as, a waste of time. And I'm glad to hear you say that, because, the movements of a game of tag are pretty similar to any evasion game that you can talk about, right? I'm evading an opponent, or I'm chasing an opponent, and then you just add other things into it to kind of give the context, like you talk about, of whatever sport it is you're kind of trying to deliver. So I jumped in there, but so you start with with a, a game of tag or some type of activation activity, and kind of where's it go from there?
Yeah, and I really like what you're saying there. We're developing functional movers in the environment when they're able to adjust their movements to information that they're perceiving. And
Yeah,
so the information that they're perceiving is running through cones or skating through cones, then these types of behaviors are going to be less adaptable to changes in the environment, which happen in the game all the time.
for sure.
So we want them to be able to regulate themselves based off of stuff that they're perceiving that's going to be
Exactly.
representative of the game.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
I mean, we might even play like handball and like
Yeah.
try to tackle each other and just all these things, and they're laughing and they're playing like kids, right? And
Yeah.
I love how you're talking about different balloons and stuff like that, and you're changing the task constraints.
Yeah.
And when you do that, there's a lot of research showing that they can self-organize in ways that gets them to search the environment differently. And so one of the favorite games at U11s, we would probably do this at the end, so I'll skip to the end.
Yeah.
We love playing with this flat little size 3 ball. Like they love this.
Yeah.
And then it's like 5v5, 4v4, and then they develop the rules in this, and we try to create this environment for them at the end where it's a ton of fun. And one of their rules is bicycle kicks are worth 10 goals. And they're not allowed to head yet, right? But since this ball is like small and flat, like they let them head it. Doesn't hurt them. So headers are 5 points, things like that. And they totally love it. And it's kind of a co-created thing, because sometimes I'll set the environment in terms of like the boundaries and where the goals are. But I'll also work with them, and they get to decide what the rules may be. And I'll ask them if I think it's like a dumb rule or something.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it. But this idea of co-creation can be a real catalyst for like autonomous, like motivated players.
How do you engage that in your U11 boys? Is that something that like happens in the moment where you have some ideas of things that could work? Like, is it happening post session to get ready for the next session, or is it happening like, you've done your warm up, you have an idea where you want to go? Are you posing those questions to the kids in the moment, or are you giving them some time to think and come back to you with something? Like, how does that work when you have a younger group?
Yeah, I kind of just let it be the jungle, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, all right, guys, I have this ball, size 3. I've set up a field for you. I would like you guys to pick teams, make the rules.
Yeah.
Team that wins, you get to add a rule. Like we'll play 5-minute games or something. So things like that, where like if you win the game, you get to add a rule, and they're just kind of creating an environment that they want, that's theirs.
Yeah.
But it's also mine, and it's a little bit hard for coaches to give up this kind of like power in a way. For sure. But you really have some motivated players in my experience and in my cultural environment where they don't get a lot of say.
Yeah.
And so when they do get some say, it's a little bit crazy at first because it's so new.
Yeah.
But then they end up like, this is the kind of behavior I see once I do this. They show up early to practice. I'm like coaching another team, and I see the boys have shown up and they've already set up their own game and they're playing their own game now, rather than what I used to see is they would just go off and like kick it into the goal, taking turns shooting, which is fine too. But I thought it was very interesting that after allowing them to be a part of the practice and the creation process, they then felt more comfortable creating their own games outside of the practice.
Right. Yeah, you got them then. I mean, that's as an educator, I think that's amazing. I think when you see your kids show up early and do their own thing, I think that's I think the goal, like you said, is if you're able to remove yourself from being puppeteer or being domineering or all controlling, and the activity continues and it's still useful and purposeful and enjoyable, probably more importantly, then you've done a really good job. So it sounds like you're doing a great job of that. So what would you say then are the main challenges? So we're opining here about all the beautiful things of representative design and having the kids, but what are the challenges that you see, whether internally or externally, forces that are kind of make it a challenge for you as a coach to kind of embrace the chaos, so to speak, of kind of this approach?
Yeah. So I kind of want to back up just a little bit because I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we'll do in the middle of the training. And then I'll jump right into the challenge.
Yeah, for sure.
Which there are plenty, right? So you start with some kind of functional movement activity, and they're moving and they're responding and they're becoming functional adaptive movers. In the middle, you can play what we're calling at Kickers constrained games. And this is where we're looking at a constraints-led approach to coaching and setting up environments. And I learned this all over the place, but sorry for rambling. A constraint,
No.
basically a constraint game would be one that's simplified versus one that is deconstructed. So if you look at a task like, I want the players, or the players are gonna, I want them to get better at passing, for example, right? I want them to get better at passing. Let's say that. And on one end, we have constraint, like a simplified game, a constraints game, where you're keeping these 5 elements of ball, opponent, direction, consequence, scoring, and representative information. You can make constraints that allow for those elements to be there. If you can do that, then hopefully that hopefully the game will be functional. So you might be playing like a 2v2 game, right? But the way that they start the game, there might be like points where there's a player starting here, there's a player starting here, here, and here, and they're like in 4 corners. Right. And importantly, you don't want to have a long line here, right? Because then players are waiting a while, and you might have like one player behind them. But you're playing a game where they start there, and there's this opportunity to pass to a teammate, or like play the puck through to a teammate between a gap. And when they start there, they get to experience this moment of seeing the gap and trying to exploit it. They might go in, if they're novice players, they might dribble in, pass, the opponent intercepts it. That's okay. Because the game continues. There's this transitional element. But then they get to go back to that point and try it again. And they gain this like comfort with the problem. And that's another thing that's really important. If you want players to be like problem solvers, all these coaches we talk about, we want players to solve problems. You have to give them problems to solve and allow them to fail while solving them. So you might see these players look at this environment where they start the game, because one player like starts with the ball and they dribble in, right? And as they dribble in, the players all come off their cones. And this gap to play through is only going to be there for a couple seconds, if even, depending on the player. And so novice players might not see the gap, either the team that's defending the gap or the team that are trying to play through it. Oh, and by the way, the point of the game is to dribble into an end zone. That's it. So you can play through the gap, then they can dribble into the end zone. And I guarantee you, when that happens a few times, the team defending will close the gap. They self-organize and then they close the gap. And then you're gaining knowledge of the environment. There's knowledge within it that they have now found. This is an opportunity for the opponent to pass through us. So now we need to close it because we've been exploited. But they have to experience it in order to learn that it's important information, right? And then you get these really cool, like complex games, and it's only 2 versus 2, where one team immediately is trying to exploit the gap, as the other team, as they're becoming more skilled, are trying to immediately close it. So once to play through isn't on, then the opportunity to play around might emerge. Because they get too close together. And then as they start to play around again, how does the other team balance? Do they prevent them from playing around? And when they do that, do they get too spread apart again? And then does it create the opportunity to play through again? And it's this constant interaction between the players. And it's like this emerging form of like life in there.
And built into that, you see all kinds of different, you talk about passing, you see different types of passing, different surfaces. They're manipulating the ball before they knock it, right? The gap closes, they're changing the angle. Maybe the receivers have to move a little bit. So, through that, you're gaining so many different adjustments that I think is the problem solving. So that's spot on.
You see deceptive behaviors emerge. I've seen it with like rec level players where they pretend to pass through that gap. The opponents close this space and then they dribble around them.
Yeah.
And these things aren't complicated. We just have to give them the space to experience it and kind of know like what you're looking for, know what you're looking at. And the game has like resources within it that they can use to regulate their actions. That's the whole idea. Well, one of the main ideas about ecological psychology is that the organism um, directly perceives the environment to regulate their behavior.
Right.
It isn't remembering some model that the coach said to regulate behavior. And if it was, it would be too slow, is the argument.
Right. Makes sense. I mean, I think anytime the people who are successful are the ones who adapt the quickest, right? I think that's important for, and it's, what you're talking about is adapting and adjusting and, making affordances to what you see and going from there. So.
Yeah. One more thing to add, David, before we get into the challenges, when you're doing the first activities, you can call them like whatever you want, like functional movement training. So we call them skill boxes just because it sounds fun, right? And you called it activation, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
You can add elements to make it more representative in that as well. And it doesn't have to be fully representative. Like one that we play is basically there's like a line and players are behind the line and they have to kick it to a teammate that's in the goal, but it has to get there in the air. So we've made a constraint. And this isn't like representative of the game, but they're learning that they have a problem to solve. How do I get the ball there in the air?
Yep.
I'm not telling them how to kick it or anything.
Right.
There might be a player that you can give ideas to, of course, but you're not saying replicate this way of kicking. Just get it there in the air, start with the problem.
Yep.
Right. And so once they kick it over there and if the player catches it, they get a point and then they run back. And then it's like a relay.
Yep.
First team to 10 wins,
Right.
Keeping things competitive, having a consequence to the like, if I don't kick it in the air, then my team might lose.
Do you think competition is important to making, all of this move well, at least within your context?
Yeah, I think it's an important bit. It's part of consequence. Like if it doesn't have to be like, this idea of competitiveness, we need to like kill each other all the time.
Yeah.
But like there's like you're playing any game at all. Like you're playing Settlers of Catan or something, right? There's a way to win and lose. Yeah. And that's important. And even if the activity is more like about problem solving and less about like strenuous movement, you can still have these transfer gains where you're learning, like you're having a higher learning load than you are physical load.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Challenges, man, dude. There's a lot.
Yeah.
You've got cultural challenges, like of like parents or whoever or coaches or organizations having set ideas of how training should look.
Yeah.
Right. And if the old idea is that we need to train skills in isolation, if you see these kinds of things, you're like, they're just scrimmaging all the time.
Yeah. Now, when you do you have many parents watch your training sessions?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And do you feel that, I mean, because again, I full disclosure, I think I believe in a lot of what we're discussing here today, and sometimes it's messy. It doesn't look like the game, and there's mistakes, and in that is the learning and the growth. But parents don't always see that. So do you feel that quiet tension kind of from the sidelines or from the bleachers from parents sometimes?
Yeah, less so now than I used to. I used to be at a club that was smaller, and it's kind of a weird cultural constraint where if you are at a place that's perceived to be bigger than, or you're paying more money for like your iPhone or something, you expect it to be better than the last thing. And so they don't question it as much because I'm at a bigger club.
Right.
That's what I believe. But they might be silently.
Yeah, for sure.
And a lot of it's depending on if teams are winning or having a good time as well. And when you do these kinds of trainings, the players are definitely enjoying it. That
was my next question, is that, because one of the first things I always ask myself at the end of a training session is did the players enjoy themselves? Like question number one. And question number two is generally what they learned today, or did they learn something? that's going to, positively impact their experience. But, do you feel that if parents are conflicted by, this doesn't look like the game that I think is supposed to look like, if their kids are telling them, excuse me, that they really enjoy what they're doing, this approach, that, you'll win the battle?
Yeah, I mean, what's the point of playing youth sports anyway? Is it to like become the best technically, or is it to have a like enjoyable, empowering experience?
Yeah.
You know, and, have something more meaningful. Like movement is meaningful to them, and it isn't something that needs to be forced out of them, or they need to feel like they're at the factory,
Yeah.
like sharpening. I want them to play, and they want to play, and they want to be creative and like be a team and have camaraderie and make each other better. And sometimes you get these kind of cultural constraints, and a lot of people do research on these things. I can link some stuff if you want, but
Yeah.
You look at the cultural constraints of like they call it neoliberalism, where it's about me and it's about my accolades and it's about my growth and my salary and my likes on social media and my attendance records and these things where it's all about the individuals, right? And then you're playing a sport that's like an invasion team game sport that's hugely about sharing and playing together and enjoying, it, and enjoying the success of your teammates and making your teammates better as well. And sometimes that doesn't happen here.
Yeah. It's tough.
You
That's
see
a
a
tough
lot
one,
of
right?
individual behavior.
Yeah,
like
no, when
motivation.
society around kids and families are pushing for the individualism, and society in general has allowed that. You can customize whatever you want. You can get everything you want individually. It's tough sometimes to have a view of the collective. So that obviously is always a challenge. Yeah, man, thank you very much. I really appreciate you helping our coaches kind of understand some of the guiding principles of representative design and some of your experiences. And I'm sure they could take a ton away from this experience and understand and how to apply it in their own practice. So thanks very much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks again, man.